In this art product review, I will be testing out the Royal & Langnickel Taklon Variety brush set of 12 brushes. I will test the brushes with watercolour, oil and acrylic paint and compare them with some of my favourite paintbrushes. So I'm going to quickly talk about price. In the UK at time of filming, April 2020, they are £9.99 and US dollars $10.69. If you'd like to check the pricing for your country of origin, then please click on the link in the description below and you'll be able to go straight to Amazon in your country. I would like to say firstly that these paintbrushes come in this great resealable packaging, so if you wanted to keep them neat and tidy, you could put the paintbrushes back in here. Say for example you're going to college, they are really useful for this. But before you make a decision on whether you would like to purchase these brushes or not, I would encourage you to watch the rest of this clip because I will be testing them out with watercolours, acrylics and oil paints, and it may be that you use just one of those mediums and these may not be the right brushes for you. So I'm going to read you the description of the brushes by Royal & Langnickel. They are a fully synthetic brush. I do prefer to use synthetic brushes because I try and avoid using animal brushes for humane reasons. I will occasionally use animal brushes, but only if I absolutely have to, because if they're the better brush. It says here they're ideal for watercolour, acrylic and tempera paints. For those of you that don't know what tempera paints are, they're water-based paints, but I actually use these for oil paints. So I'm going to show you how these have fared with oil paints, and just to let you know, I've already used this set for a couple of paintings, which I will show you one of these paintings, and I don't think it turned out that bad. And I've washed them with Masters brush soap, so they've been perfectly fine. So that will be testament to the fact that they do actually work okay with oils. They have a kiln dried hardwood handles that won't crack. I've never heard of that before, but obviously that helps. For the record, I've had someone in my household has borrowed mine previously, an older set that I have, and they have left them in water overnight and that has made the paint crack off, but I would recommend you don't do that. But the actual core of the brush has been absolutely fine. I have an older set of similar ones of these. I'm not sure whether they're gold Taklon ones, but I still use some of them, so they've been very durable. They have a high quality, seamless, corrosion resistant aluminium ferrule, and they are great for advanced, beginner artists, students, crafters and hobbyists. Again, I know that some people can pay up to, well, over £100 for a brush. There's the particular brands, I'm not going to name what they are, but I have a philosophy that I prefer not to pay a lot for paintbrushes. If I can avoid it, I will show you some of the brushes. I'm going to compare these brushes with other brushes that I use. And there are a brand of detail brushes that I use, say for example nail brushes. They are very, very, very reasonably priced. And the reason I like to use those is because they have such fine hairs. They don't last that long with my oil paints. So they're almost disposable. And I prefer to use those over really expensive detail brushes because if I buy the expensive ones, I'm going to end up getting rid of those anyway, because I like to think about conservation. Why would I spend so much money on brushes that I'm going to be getting rid of rather than the inexpensive ones that serve the same purpose? So I think this is something that comes down to experience and preference. So I'm just going to talk about different medias. I'm going to try these out with watercolours, oil paints and acrylics, and I'm going to compare these with different brushes that I already own, and then we can get an idea of which ones you prefer. So let's get into what types of brushes are included in this set. I will talk more about how I use the brushes later, because obviously I'm using the majority of these brushes for oil paints, but on this image you will see how the Royal & Langnickel brand are recommending how they would use them. Personally, I would not use them in this way, but because I mainly use oil paints and I paint portraits, but this is how they were recommending that you would use these paintbrushes. So before we get into testing the brushes out, I will let you know how many and what size there are of each of the brushes. So we have a size 6 and 16 in the round brush, a 4 and 24 in the flat, a 10 and 20 in the filbert, an 8 and 18 in the angular, and a 2, a 12 and a 22 in the bright. So we're going to start this by testing the watercolour brushes, and I'm going to be using the size 16 round brush by Royal & Langnickel, and I will be comparing that with a brand that I use quite frequently when I'm painting with watercolours, and that is a silver black and velvet brush. I'll go into more detail with that in a minute. So I'm starting by applying a layer of water. I'm going to use wet on wet technique first, and I will be using the smaller brushes afterwards for a wet on dry technique, just to give a balance of the two different techniques and how I would use the brushes. And obviously this is just a balance or a view of how I would use brushes. Different people might use them differently, but I'm trying to give you a balanced view of all the different medias that I use. So I've stuck down the watercolour paper, and I will give you links in the description below of all of the medias, everything that I've used in this clip. So if you're wondering about a particular medium that I've used and it's not in the frame, then just have a look in the description below. So I'm starting now applying a layer of the blue watercolour with the paintbrush. Remember, this is a fully synthetic paintbrush, so it won't hold as much water as the paintbrush that I'm going to compare it to, which is a mixture of synthetic and natural hair. And it seems to be blending really well. It doesn't hold as much water, so I do keep having to go back to the water to reapply, but it's not too much difficulty. When you would run into difficulty would be if you were doing a large project, say for example on a piece of A3 paper upwards, and I do tend to paint on A3, A2, so this may not be a suitable brush for me for those projects, but other than that, this is a perfectly suitable brush to use for watercolour. So I'm now going to move on to the silver size 12 black velvet brush. That's also a round brush like the Royal & Langnickel brush. This is a size 12, but it's a similar size, and you will see very quickly that this holds more water, and that is because of the makeup of the brush, in that it is a mixture of synthetic and hair, natural hair. So I'm going to paint the same design. I'm going to try and keep both of these samples as similar as possible, and you will notice straight away that this is holding more water. Now, there isn't too much of an issue between the two samples, in that you won't notice too much difference between the two if you paint smaller projects. So say for example you paint small card designs, this Royal & Langnickel brush would be perfectly acceptable for you. However, if you are a watercolour artist and you paint larger projects, I think you may run into difficulty because you would have to be continually going back and refreshing your brush with the water. So for me, I feel that wet on wet technique would be difficult using the Royal & Langnickel, but obviously this is a personal choice. I personally, for wet on wet technique, would prefer the silver brush, but this is personal choice, and obviously you have to consider the price point. The silver brush, the silver black velvet range brushes are significantly more expensive, so really they're a luxury item and they would be an investment. I have had these brushes for nearly 2 years now, and they are incredible as long as you look after them, obviously, like all of these things. But not to put any of you off, but for watercolour, I don't consider this larger watercolour brush to be a good investment if you work on a larger scale. So I'm going to talk now about the wet on dry technique. So I'm now using the smaller watercolour brush, and I'm going to complete the wet on dry technique with this smaller brush. Now, one thing that I do have to mention is that if you like painting details, this brush would actually be a good brush for you. Obviously, I've mentioned before that when I'm painting really tiny details, say for example eyelashes, I do actually use the more reasonably priced nail brushes. But for this, the reason why the synthetic brush is a good choice is because there isn't a lot of give. It can be quite rigid, so this is a good choice for painting details. So I'm now going to use the silver brush, which is a size 4. The previous one was a size 6, and again they're quite similar in their size. Now, because this has got natural hairs in it, there's a bit more give, so it can sometimes give too much and it won't be as precise, but I'm doing okay here. It's okay, but I know that if I put too much pressure on it, it will give. But for what I'm doing, it seems to be okay. Bear in mind this brush is slightly smaller, so the lines are a little bit finer, but I know that if I press too much on that, it will give. But I think both brushes are good. I would expect the silver one to be good because it's significantly more expensive. But they are both good brushes for the Wet on Dry. And if I was going to choose the suitability of one of the Royal and Langnickels over the others, you know, the size 6 or the size 16, I would certainly say the size 6 is perfect for watercolour, whereas the larger one, because the expectation and the needs of a larger brush are significantly more, I would say for watercolours I would not be using that large brush, just because you can't expect it to hold the water because it's a synthetic brush, whereas the smaller brushes you can use synthetic. So just for watercolours, I would say don't buy this pack of brushes if you're expecting to be doing a large amount of watercolour work. So firstly, I'm going to compare the brushes with acrylic paint, and I'm going to do some basic blending with white and black paint, first with the acrylic and then I will do that with the oil paint. And I'm going to start by putting the white paint on first, and I will do this with the larger flat brush, and it's very straightforward. I'll just put the white on, then I will blend the black. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend the paint out with the larger filbert brush at the top, and then I will blend it out at the bottom with one of my most used filbert brushes, which is a Winsor & Newton filbert brush. I will put all the links in the description below for everything that I've used in today's clip, so don't worry if you want to find a particular item. The links should work with all countries going back to Amazon. So the filbert brush I found was a little bit on the tough side, the Royal and Langnickel one. I found that what it did was it skimmed the surface because it was quite hard. The synthetic brushes are quite hard, whereas the Winsor & Newton brush has a mixture of the natural and the synthetic, so it was quite a bit softer. I use this quite a lot on my skin tones with my portraits. I should say that on my recent portrait that I painted, for which there is a free tutorial, and you can go to the link in the description below if you want to access a free tutorial, and you will see me use these brushes on that tutorial also. I do use the smaller filbert brush throughout that, so say for example around the eyes and the lips, you will see me using that small filbert brush, and I did find that small filbert brush really useful for those areas. But for the larger areas, I think I would struggle with this with acrylic paint. I didn't use the larger one with the oil painting when I did that, and we'll see how that fares in a moment, because I do rely quite heavily on the Winsor & Newton. So with this, I found with the acrylic paint it did grab the surface quite a lot, so the surface was coming through. However, with my Winsor & Newton, it was very smooth because the bristles are quite soft. So now on to the oil painting test. So I applied this in the same way, only I did the black in reverse because lighter colours dominate darker colours when you're using oil paints. So I just applied them in the same way, and then I went in with the filbert brushes. So I used the Royal and Langnickel on the top sample and the Winsor & Newton on the bottom sample in exactly the same way as the acrylics on the left. What I did find with these samples was that the filberts worked in a pretty similar way, and this may be because of the consistency of the oil paint. I didn't thin these oil paints down in any way, I just used them as they were directly out of the tubes, and this is reassuring because I haven't used a large filbert brush with my skin tones, but I may use it in the future. Now the reason why this is helpful is because when I use my filbert brushes, I have to use them completely dry, so it's really useful to have a spare backup just in case I need it. So I will certainly be using this filbert brush when I'm blending my skin tones in the future. Overall, my main impressions of these sets were, for oil paints, they're great. I use them for oil paints quite regularly, and I hadn't tried out the large filbert, but I will certainly be using that in the future. Watercolours, not so much, but I would certainly be able to use a smaller brush. And acrylics, I wouldn't use the filbert, but I would certainly use the flats and the angular brushes. If you would like to see more art product reviews, then click on the playlist above. If you would like to paint with me in real time, then click on the link below. If there are any products that you would like to find out more information about or any links, then please look in the description below.